The council elder pressed the woven cord into Tessa Zorrath's palm and told her that her marriage would save 200 lives. And she believed him because she had counted the graves herself that spring. She stood at the riverbank crossing in a dress dyed the deep blue her grandmother had worn at her own wedding, her small tusks catching the late afternoon light, her dark hair braided with the last of the autumn wildflowers. The cord in her hand was meant to be given to her husband, whoever he turned out to be, a symbol of binding between families. She had practiced the words all week. Her hands had stopped shaking an hour ago, which she took as a kind of victory, though her stomach still felt like it was trying to crawl up into her throat. Across the narrow span of the Graymere River, 5 figures waited. Humans, all of them, dressed in the dark leather and wool of the Westridge settlements. 20 years of war had made both peoples experts in recognizing each other across distances. She could see the tallest one holding a staff with a white banner, the truce flag that had flown for 3 weeks now while the elders hammered out the terms of peace. Terms that included her. Her uncle Rothak stood beside her, his face carved from granite and old grief. He had lost 2 sons to the war. When he looked at her now, she saw him calculating whether this bargain was worth it. She wanted to tell him it was. She wanted to tell him she went willingly. She wanted to ask him if she had any other choice. "They are crossing now," Rothak said. 3 of the figures stepped into the shallow ford, boots splashing in the current. The river was low this time of year, the stones slick but passable. Tessa watched them come and tried to imagine a life on the far side of that water, in a house she had never seen, speaking vows to a man whose face she could not yet make out. The one who reached her first was older, his beard more gray than brown, his eyes the color of winter sky. He stopped 3 paces away and inclined his head in what might have been respect or might have been assessment. "I am Garrett Wells, captain of the Westridge militia. We have come for the girl." "Tessa Zorrath," her uncle said, and his voice almost did not break. "Offered in bond and good faith, to seal the peace between our peoples." The captain's gaze moved to her. She lifted her chin and met his eyes because her mother had told her that morning that she came from a line of women who did not flinch. "I am ready," she said, and was proud that the words came out steady. But the captain was looking past her now, to the second man who had crossed the ford. This one was younger, perhaps mid-20s, tall and lean in the way of men who had grown up hungry and stayed dangerous. His hair was dark, his jaw shadowed with stubble, and his eyes were the kind of brown that looked black in certain lights. He wore no decoration, no mark of rank, just a worn leather jerkin and boots that had seen 100 miles. There was a sword at his hip, battered and plain, the weapon of someone who knew how to use it. "Matthias Wade," the captain said. "You will escort her back to the settlement." The young man said nothing. He was looking at Tessa with an expression she could not read, something between recognition and revulsion, and she felt the fragile composure she had built all day start to crack. This was the man they were sending to claim her. This silent, scarred stranger who looked at her like she was a problem he had not agreed to solve. Matthias Wade turned to the captain. "No." The single word dropped into the afternoon like a stone into still water. Tessa felt the ripples of it, saw her uncle stiffen, saw the other humans exchange glances that ranged from confusion to alarm. "Soldier," the captain said, and there was warning in his voice. "I said no." Matthias looked at Tessa again, and this time she saw what was in his eyes. Not hatred, not desire, something worse and better at once. Pity. "She is a person, not a sack of grain. We do not trade people for treaties." "The terms were agreed," her uncle said, and there was panic creeping into his tone because this was not how any of this was supposed to happen. "The girl is offered freely." Is she? Matthias asked, and though his voice was quiet, it carried the weight of every battlefield he had walked away from. Did anyone ask her what she wanted? Tessa found her voice, though it came out smaller than she intended. I want the war to end. So do I. He took a step toward her, and she saw the others tense, hands moving toward weapons that had been promised to stay sheathed. But Matthias was not reaching for his sword. He was holding out his hand, palm up, empty. So we will find another way. Come on, I am walking you home. The world seemed to tilt. Tessa stared at his outstretched hand like it was a snake that might bite. I do not understand. I am refusing the terms, he said. They can marry their own daughters to each other if they want to seal a treaty with wedding vows. You do not get sold like livestock to pay for my people's violence. Matthias, the captain said, and now there was more than warning in his voice. There was the kind of anger that came before someone made a decision they could not take back. Stand down. No, sir. You will reignite this war. Then we will find a way to stop it that does not cost her everything. Matthias looked at Tessa, and she saw something in his face that made her chest ache. Certainty. The kind of certainty that got people killed. You do not have to do this. You do not owe us your life. Her uncle grabbed her arm. Tessa, the clan agreed to this. You shame us all if you refuse now. She looked at Rothak and saw the desperation there, the weight of 2 dead sons and 100 dead neighbors pressing down on him. She looked at the human captain and saw the same calculation in his eyes that she had seen in the Orc Council's faces when they decided what she was worth. She looked back across the river at the Westridge settlement in the distance, at the home that would never be hers, at the cage dressed up as marriage. Then she looked at Matthias Wade, this strange, scarred man who had just thrown away whatever orders he had been given because he thought she deserved a choice. She reached out and took his hand. His fingers closed around hers, warm and rough with calluses, and he nodded once. Then he turned and started walking back across the ford, pulling her gently with him. Not toward Westridge, toward the opposite bank, toward home. Chaos erupted behind them. Her uncle was shouting. The captain was shouting. Someone on the orc side of the river started yelling about broken oaths, and someone on the human side yelled back about treachery. Tessa heard the sound of steel leaving leather, heard voices raised in anger and alarm. She stumbled on the slick river stones, and Matthias steadied her without breaking stride, his hand firm and unyielding. They climbed the far bank, and he released her hand only long enough to turn and face the furious crowd gathering at the water's edge. The captain was in the river now, his face red with anger. You are a traitor and a deserter, Wade. You will hang for this, maybe, Matthias said, but not today. The treaty is broken. Then we will write a better one. He took Tessa's hand again and started walking up the dirt road that led into orc territory, into the hills and forests that his people had burned and raided for 20 years. She followed because she did not know what else to do, because her legs were moving and her heart was hammering, and nothing about the last 5 minutes made any sense at all. They walked in silence for the first mile. The sun was dropping toward the horizon, casting long shadows through the trees. Tessa kept waiting for him to explain, to tell her what he was thinking, to say anything at all. But Matthias Wade walked like a man who had said everything he needed to say and saw no reason to add to it. Finally, she could not stand it anymore. Why did you do that? He glanced at her, his expression unreadable in the fading light. Because it was wrong. The war will start again. Maybe. People will die. People die in wars whether there is a treaty or not. He kept walking, his pace steady and ground-eating, the stride of someone who had marched across half a continent and learned to measure distance in stamina rather than speed. If the only way to stop a war is to sell a girl to her enemies, then the peace is worthless. "I am not a child," Tessa said, and was annoyed to hear the defensiveness in her voice. "I understood what I was agreeing to." "Did you have a choice?" She wanted to say yes. She wanted to tell him that she had volunteered, that no one had forced her, that she had walked to that riverbank of her own free will. But the words stuck in her throat because they would have been a lie, and she found she did not want to lie to this man who had just destroyed his own life for hers. "No," she said quietly. "I did not have a choice." He nodded as if that settled something. They walked on as the sky turned from blue to purple to the deep indigo that came before full dark. Tessa realized with a start that she had no idea where they were going. The road led north into the hills, toward the scattered homesteads and small villages that made up the southern edge of her clan's territory, but her family's farm was east of here, a good day's travel across rough country. "Where are we going?" she asked. "Your home. Where else?" "You do not know where that is." He looked at her again, and something that might have been amusement flickered in his dark eyes. "Then you will have to tell me. It is a full day's walk from here, maybe more. We will not make it before nightfall. Then we will camp." He said it like it was the simplest thing in the world, like he had not just committed treason and dragged her into the wilderness with no supplies, no plan, and no idea what came next. Tessa felt something bubble up in her chest that was either hysteria or laughter or both. "You are insane." "Probably. They will hunt you. Both sides will hunt you, I know. You have thrown away everything. Your rank, your home, maybe your life. For what? You do not even know me." Matthias stopped walking. The last of the daylight caught in his hair, turning it from black to dark brown, and when he looked at her his eyes were serious and sad and absolutely certain. "I know you did not deserve to be traded like a horse. That is enough." Tessa felt something crack inside her chest, some defensive wall she had built that morning when the council told her what they needed from her. Tears stung her eyes and she blinked them back furiously because she had not cried then and she would not cry now. "I do not understand you." "You do not have to." He started walking again. "Just tell me which way to go when the road forks." They camped that night in a small clearing off the main road, under a stand of pine trees that smelled like resin and old rain. Matthias built a fire with the quick efficiency of someone who had done it 1,000 times, coaxing flames from damp wood and a single flint strike. He had no bedroll, no supplies beyond the waterskin at his hip and the knife at his belt, but he gave her his cloak without being asked and settled himself on the far side of the fire with his back against a tree trunk. Tessa wrapped herself in the cloak and tried not to think about how her wedding dress was getting filthy, how her grandmother would weep to see the careful embroidery stained with mud and pine sap. Tried not to think about what was happening back at the crossing, whether the fragile piece had shattered completely or whether the elders were scrambling to salvage something from the wreckage. "You should sleep," Matthias said. His eyes were on the darkness beyond the firelight, watchful and alert. "I will keep watch. I am not tired. You are exhausted. I can see it." She wanted to argue but found she did not have the energy. The adrenaline that had carried her through the day was draining away, leaving her hollow and shaky. She lay down on the hard ground and pulled the cloak tighter around her shoulders. It smelled like leather and wood smoke and something else, something that was just him, and she found it oddly comforting. "Matthias," she said into the darkness. "Yes, thank you." He was silent for a long moment, then so quietly she almost missed it. "You are welcome." She fell asleep to the crackle of the fire, and the steady, watchful presence of the man who had refused to let her be sold. Morning came gray and cold, mist rising from the forest floor like the ghosts of all the soldiers who had died in these hills. Tessa woke to find Matthias already up, the fire rebuilt, and a handful of early mushrooms roasting on a flat stone at the edge of the flames. He handed her half without comment, and they ate in silence, the food meager but enough to take the edge off her hunger. "Which way?" he asked when they finished. She pointed northeast toward the rising sun. "Through the hills. There is a shepherd's track that will take us most of the way." He nodded and kicked dirt over the fire. They walked. The first day passed in a strange, stretched silence. Tessa kept expecting him to talk, to explain himself, to ask her questions about her life or her clan or her thoughts on the war. But Matthias seemed content to walk without words, his attention on the trail ahead and the forest around them. It should have been uncomfortable, that silence, but somehow it was not. It felt instead like walking with someone who understood that some things did not need to be said aloud. They saw no one that first day. The shepherd's track was overgrown and little used, winding through stands of birch and oak and across small streams that ran clear and cold from the high country. Tessa's feet began to ache in her wedding shoes, impractical things meant for standing still and looking pretty rather than hiking through rough terrain. She did not complain. Matthias had given up more than sore feet for her, and she would not shame herself by whining, but he noticed anyway. Of course he did. When they stopped at a stream to refill the waterskin, he knelt and looked at her feet with a critical eye. "Those will give you blisters. I will survive. Probably." He stood and looked around the clearing, his gaze settling on a dead birch that had fallen across the stream. He drew his knife, cut several long strips of soft inner bark and brought them back to her. "Take off the shoes. Wrap these around your feet instead. It will help." She wanted to refuse, wanted to prove she did not need his help, but her feet were already raw and they had another day of walking ahead of them. So she sat on a rock and peeled off the ruined shoes and tried not to wince as the air hit the blisters that had already formed on her heels. Matthias knelt in front of her and took one of her feet in his hands. His touch was gentle, impersonal, the hands of someone who had wrapped wounds and tended injuries in the field. He wound the bark around her foot with careful precision, tying it in place with thin strips of leather he cut from his own belt. Then he did the same with the other foot. "Better?" he asked. She stood and tested her weight. The bark was soft and flexible, cushioning her feet far better than the stiff leather shoes had. "Yes, thank you." He just nodded and stood, gathering up her discarded shoes. He tied them together by the laces and hung them from his belt, carrying them for her without being asked. Then he turned and started walking again, and she followed. They camped again that night, and the next morning they crested a ridge and Tessa saw the familiar outline of the valley where she had grown up. The sight of it made her throat tight. The small farmhouse with its thatched roof, the barn where her father kept the goats, the vegetable garden her mother tended, the apple orchard that had been planted by her great-grandfather. "Home. There," she said, pointing. "That is where I live." Matthias looked down at the valley and something crossed his face, quick and gone. Relief, maybe, or sadness. "Then we are almost done." They descended into the valley as the sun climbed toward noon. Tessa felt her steps slowing as they approached the farm, dread and hope warring in her chest. What would her parents say? What would they do? She had been traded away to save the clan, and now she was coming back with one of the enemy, the treaty in ruins and the peace shattered. Her mother saw them first. She was in the garden, a basket of beans on her hip, and she looked up at the sound of footsteps on the path. The basket fell from her hands, beans scattering across the dirt. "Tessa." "Mother," Tessa said, and then she was running, closing the distance between them and falling into her mother's arms. The older orc woman held her tight, her hands shaking as she clutched her daughter close. "What happened?" her mother demanded. "What are you doing here?" The council said you were married, that you were gone, that the peace was sealed, she broke off, her eyes focusing on Matthias for the first time. Her whole body went rigid. Human. He brought me home, Tessa said quickly. Mother, he refused the bargain. He walked me home instead. Her mother stared at Matthias like he was a puzzle with missing pieces. He stood at the edge of the garden, still and watchful, his hand resting on his sword hilt but not drawing. Non-threatening but not defenseless either. Why? Her mother asked, and the question was directed at him. Because she is not property, Matthias said. His voice was quiet but firm. She should not have been traded. The clan agreed. The council agreed. Both sides agreed. I did not. Tessa's father came out of the barn then, alerted by the voices. He was a big man, broad-shouldered and thick-armed from a lifetime of farm work, his tusks longer and more prominent than Tessa's. He took one look at the scene, his daughter back home and a human man standing in his garden, and his face went hard as stone. Tessa, get in the house. Father, now. She did not move. She planted her feet and lifted her chin and met her father's eyes. He saved me, Father. He refused to take me. He walked me home instead, and he has probably signed his own death warrant to do it. Her father's gaze shifted to Matthias. Is this true? Yes. Why? Matthias looked at Tessa, and something in his expression made her breath catch. Because she deserves better than to be a bargaining chip in someone else's war. The silence that followed was thick and dangerous. Tessa's father studied Matthias with the careful attention of a man who had spent 20 years learning to spot traps and ambushes. You are a soldier. I was. You fought in the war. Yes. Killed orcs. Matthias did not flinch. Yes. And now you bring my daughter back and expect what? Gratitude. Forgiveness. I expect nothing, Matthias said. I brought her home because it was the right thing to do. What you do now is your choice. Tessa's father looked like he wanted to argue, to rage, to drive this human from his land and his family. But her mother put a hand on his arm, and when he looked down at her, she shook her head slightly. He could have kept her, her mother said quietly. He could have taken her across the river and done whatever he pleased. Instead, he brought her home. That means something. Her father's jaw worked, muscles bunching under his green skin. Finally, he nodded once. Come inside, both of you. We need to talk. The farmhouse was small and tidy, the kind of home built by people who worked with their hands and valued function over decoration. Tessa's mother made tea while her father sat at the worn wooden table and studied Matthias like he was a military map that needed deciphering. What is your name? He asked. Matthias Wade. Wade. Her father's eyes narrowed. I knew a Wade, fought him at the Battle of Ashridge. Big man, red beard, fought with an axe, killed 6 of our warriors before we brought him down. My uncle, Matthias said. He died when I was 15. I am sorry for your loss. The words hung in the air, strange and awkward and somehow necessary. Matthias nodded. And I am sorry for yours. Her father grunted, accepting that. The council will not be pleased that Tessa has returned. They will see it as a broken oath. The oath was theirs to break, not hers, Matthias said. That may be true, but it does not change the consequences. Her father leaned forward, his massive hands folded on the table. The war will start again. You know that. Westridge will say we betrayed the treaty. Our clan will say you stole what was rightfully given. Blood will flow. Then we stop it. How? Matthias looked at Tessa, and she saw something in his eyes that she had not seen before. Not pity, not certainty. Hope, fragile and new and absolutely terrifying. We write a new treaty, one that does not trade people like goods. One based on mutual benefit rather than sacrifice. Her father laughed, a bitter sound. You think it is that simple? That 2 sides who have been killing each other for 20 years will just sit down and talk because you ask nicely? No, Matthias said. but I think they are tired. I think they have buried enough sons and daughters. I think if someone offered them a way out that did not cost them their pride, they might take it. And you think you can offer that? I think we can try." Her mother set cups of tea on the table, the steam rising in fragrant curls. She sat down next to her husband and looked at Matthias with sharp, assessing eyes. "You are risking your life for this. For my daughter, yes, but also for a peace that may never come." "Why?" Matthias was quiet for a long moment, his hands wrapped around the cup, his gaze distant. When he spoke, his voice was soft. "I have spent 8 years fighting this war. I have killed men and orcs whose names I will never know, for reasons that seemed important at the time and meaningless now. I have watched friends die in mud and blood, have stood guard over graves that stretch from here to the coast. And for what? A few miles of disputed territory. Old grudges no one can even remember the origin of." He looked up, and his eyes were haunted. "I am tired of death. I am tired of pretending that any of this matters enough to justify what it costs. If I can stop even one more person from being traded away, from being sacrificed on the altar of someone else's pride, then maybe the last 8 years will not have been completely wasted." Tessa felt her chest tighten. She had thought she understood what he had done, why he had refused the bargain and walked her home. But hearing him say it aloud, hearing the exhaustion and grief and desperate hope in his voice, made it real in a way it had not been before. Her father stared at Matthias for a long, measuring moment. Then he nodded slowly. "All right, say we try. Say we attempt to broker a new peace. How do we even begin?" "We need people both sides will listen to," Matthias said. "People respected on both sides of the river. Can you think of anyone?" Tessa's mother and father exchanged glances. Her mother spoke first. "Elder Corva might listen. She lost her grandson in the war last spring. She has been pushing for peace for years." "And on our side," Matthias said slowly, "there is Commander Isabel Wright. She is the senior officer in the Westridge garrison. She fought in the war, but she also lost her husband to it. She advocated for the treaty. She might be willing to hear us out." "Might," her father said heavily, "but you are a deserter now, boy. They will not let you just walk back into Westridge and ask for a meeting." "I know." Matthias met her father's eyes. "That is why we will need a mediator. Someone who can carry messages between the two sides, who can set up a meeting on neutral ground. A human and an orc traveling together will draw attention," her mother pointed out. "Then we will need to be careful." Tessa set down her cup, the porcelain clicking against the wood. "I will go with you." All three of them turned to stare at her. Her father opened his mouth to refuse, but she cut him off. "This started with me. The treaty that broke, the bargain that was refused, if we are going to fix it, I should be part of that." She looked at Matthias and saw something flicker in his eyes. Pride, maybe, or concern. "You said I deserved a choice. This is my choice." Her mother reached across the table and took her hand. "Tessa, darling, this is dangerous." "So is war," Tessa said. "So is being traded away like a sack of grain. I would rather risk danger trying to build something better than sit here and wait for the violence to come to our door." Her father sighed, a long, defeated sound. "You are your mother's daughter, stubborn as old oak." He looked at Matthias. "If you let harm come to her, I will hunt you to the ends of the earth. Understood?" "I mean it, human. My daughter's life is worth more to me than any peace." "It is worth more than any peace," Matthias agreed. "That is why I brought her home." Her father held his gaze for a moment longer, then nodded. "All right. When do we start?" They spent the rest of that day planning. Tessa's father knew which elders might be sympathetic to a new peace and which would resist out of sheer stubbornness or old hatred. Her mother contributed names of traders and merchants who had maintained quiet contact across the river even during the war. People who understood that commerce required stability, and who might be willing to support a treaty based on mutual profit rather than shared blood. Matthias outlined the military structure on the Westridge side, identifying officers who were tired of the fighting and bureaucrats who cared more about budgets than glory. Together, they sketched out a rough plan, a fragile framework of who to approach and how to make the case that peace was more valuable than pride. As evening fell, Tessa's mother insisted that Matthias stay for dinner. The meal was simple: bread and stew and roasted vegetables from the garden, but it was the first real food Tessa had eaten in 3 days, and it tasted like heaven. Matthias ate with the quiet focus of a soldier, but when her mother offered him seconds he hesitated, then accepted with a murmured thanks that made Tessa's mother smile. After dinner, her father showed Matthias to the small guest room at the back of the house, a space usually reserved for traveling kin, but now offered to the human who had saved their daughter. Matthias paused at the threshold, looking back at Tessa with an expression she could not quite read. "Thank you," he said. "For what?" "For trusting me." She wanted to tell him that trust had nothing to do with it, that she had followed him because she was confused and frightened and had no idea what else to do, but that would have been only half true. The other half, the part she was not quite ready to name, was that she trusted him more than she had trusted anyone in a long time. More than the council who had traded her. More than the uncle who had delivered her to the crossing. More than the clan who had decided her life was an acceptable price for peace. "You gave me a choice," she said instead. "That is worth more than you know." He held her gaze for a moment, then nodded and disappeared into the guest room. Tessa stood in the hallway and tried to understand what she was feeling, this strange tangle of gratitude and confusion and something else, something warm and fragile and entirely unexpected. She went to bed that night in her own room, in her own bed, and for the first time since the council had told her she was being traded away, she felt safe. The next morning they began. Tessa's father knew a trader named Gorvan, who had maintained contact with merchants on the Westridge side throughout the war, smuggling goods and information across the river when the need arose and the price was right. He was not a particularly honorable man, but he was practical, and he understood that a stable peace was better for business than sporadic warfare. They found him in the village market, haggling over the price of wool with a shepherd who looked ready to punch him. Tessa's father waited until the transaction was complete, then approached with Matthias and Tessa trailing behind. "Gorvan, I need a favor." The trader looked up, his small eyes narrowing. He was a compact man, more human-sized than most orcs, with a shrewd face and quick hands. "Tessa Zorrath. I heard your daughter was traded away for the treaty. What is she doing back here? Long story. I need you to carry a message to Westridge." Gorvan's gaze shifted to Matthias, and his expression went carefully neutral. "A human and an orc walking together. That is a story worth hearing." "Later," Tessa's father said. "Right now, I need to know if you can get a message to Commander Isabel Wright without getting yourself killed." "The commander," Gorvan whistled low. "That is asking a lot, Tark. I know, name your price." They haggled for 10 minutes while Tessa tried not to pace. Finally, Gorvan agreed to carry a sealed letter to Westridge in exchange for a goat and a bolt of cloth, payment that made Tessa's father wince but which he accepted with a grim nod. Matthias wrote the letter at Tessa's kitchen table, his handwriting surprisingly neat for a soldier. He kept it brief and formal, explaining that he had refused the tribute and requesting a meeting on neutral ground to discuss alternative terms for peace. He sealed it with wax and handed it to Gorvan, who tucked it into his shirt and disappeared into the crowd. "Now we wait," Tessa's father said. Waiting turned out to be harder than walking. Tessa spent the next 3 days helping her mother in the garden, mending fences with her father, and trying not to think about what was happening in Westridge. Trying not to imagine Matthias being dragged before a firing squad, or Commander Wright throwing the letter away unopened, or the fragile hope they had built collapsing under the weight of old hatred. Matthias spent those days working. He seemed unable to sit still, so he helped Tessa's father repair the barn roof, chopped wood for the winter stores, and fixed a broken wagon wheel with the kind of focused competence that spoke to years of solving problems with his hands. Tessa's parents watched him with cautious approval. This human who worked without complaint and did not flinch from the hard labor that farm life demanded. On the third evening, as the sun was setting and Tessa was bringing in the goats, she found Matthias sitting on the fence rail, his face turned toward the western sky. She climbed up next to him, and they sat in silence for a while, watching the light fade. "You think she will agree to meet?" Tessa asked. "I do not know." "What will you do if she does not?" He was quiet for a moment, his hands resting on his knees. "Try something else. Keep trying until something works, or until someone kills you. That is a possibility." She looked at him, at the tired lines around his eyes and the scars that marked his hands and arms. Evidence of a hard life of battles fought and survived. "Why are you so calm about that?" "I am not calm," he said. "I am terrified, but terror does not change what needs to be done. You could run, disappear. No one would blame you for trying to save yourself." He turned to look at her, and in the fading light his eyes were very dark and very serious. "I would blame me." Tessa felt something shift in her chest, some understanding clicking into place. She had thought he was brave or noble or perhaps just reckless. But it was none of those things. He was simply a man who had seen too much death and decided that he could not live with himself if he did not try to stop it, no matter what it cost him. "Matthias," she said softly. "Yes." "I am glad you refused." He smiled, a small, sad expression that did not quite reach his eyes. "So am I." Gorvan returned on the fourth day, dusty and exhausted and carrying a sealed letter bearing the commander's mark. Tessa's hands shook as she broke the seal, and Matthias leaned over her shoulder to read. The letter was brief. Commander Wright agreed to a meeting at the old mill on the border, 3 days hence, at noon. She guaranteed Matthias safe passage to and from the meeting, but warned that if this was some kind of trap, the consequences would be swift and brutal. "She will meet," Tessa said, and heard the relief in her own voice. "Now the hard part begins," her father said. "We need to convince Elder Corva to attend as well." Elder Corva lived on the northern edge of the valley, in a stone house that had stood for 3 generations. She was ancient by orc standards, her skin weathered and lined, her tusks yellowed with age. But her mind was sharp, and her influence in the clan was undeniable. When Tessa and her parents arrived at her door, she looked at them with eyes that missed nothing. "I heard you came back, girl. That was foolish." "It was necessary," Tessa said, "and you brought a human with you." "Even more foolish." "He refused to accept me as payment for peace," Tessa said. "He walked me home instead." Corva studied Matthias with the same intensity she might use to examine a suspicious contract. "Why?" "Because she is a person, not a commodity," Matthias said. "Idealistic nonsense," Corva said, but there was something in her tone that was not quite dismissal. "The world does not work that way, boy. It should. Should and does are different words for a reason." She turned to Tessa's father. "What do you want, Tark?" "We are trying to broker a new treaty," he said. "One based on trade and mutual benefit rather than forced marriage. Commander Wright has agreed to meet and discuss terms. We need someone from our side to speak with her, someone respected, someone who wants peace." Corva was silent for a long time, her gaze distant. When she spoke, her voice was heavy with old grief. I lost my grandson last spring, Ralvac. He was 19 years old, brave and foolish and everything a young warrior should be. He died defending a meaningless stretch of river that neither side needed and both sides claimed. His death bought us nothing. I am sorry, Matthias said quietly. Your people killed him. Yes, and my people have lost just as many to yours. The killing has to stop. It stopped. The treaty was signed. A treaty built on sacrifice is not a real peace, Matthias said. It is just a pause before the next atrocity. You know that. I know you do, or you would not have advocated for peace all these years. Corva's eyes narrowed. You are presumptuous, human. I am honest. She made a sound that might have been a laugh or a grunt of irritation. You are reckless and naive and probably going to get yourself killed, but you are also right. The treaty was flawed. It asked too much of people who had already given everything. She looked at Tessa. You would have gone through with it, the marriage. I would have, Tessa said, but I am grateful I did not have to. And if this new peace fails, if the war starts again, then at least we tried, Tessa said. At least we did not accept that my life was the price of peace. Corva nodded slowly. All right, I will attend your meeting. I will speak for the clan, though I cannot promise they will listen, but I will try. Relief flooded through Tessa so strongly her knees nearly buckled. Thank you, Elder. Do not thank me yet. We have not accomplished anything. Corva stood, leaning heavily on her walking stick. 3 days, you said, at the old mill. Yes. Then we had better start preparing. If we are going to convince two sides who hate each other to sit down and negotiate, we will need more than good intentions. They spent the next 3 days in frantic preparation. Matthias and Tessa's father drafted a proposal for the new treaty, outlining terms for shared fishing rights on the river, joint patrols to discourage banditry, and the establishment of a trading post at the old mill, where merchants from both sides could meet safely. Tessa's mother gathered testimonials from families on both sides who had lost loved ones in the war, stories of grief and waste that might move hearts hardened by years of conflict. Tessa herself worked with Elder Corva, refining the arguments they would make, anticipating objections and preparing responses. The elder was a shrewd negotiator, and she pushed Tessa hard, demanding that every point be airtight and every claim defensible. You cannot appeal to sentiment alone, Corva said as they reviewed the proposal on the second night. Wright is a military commander. She will want concrete benefits, clear terms, and assurance that her side is not being cheated. The terms are fair, Tessa said. Both sides gain access to the river. Both sides benefit from the trade. Fair is subjective. What feels fair to you may feel like defeat to someone who has been fighting for 20 years and does not want to admit it was pointless. Corva tapped the parchment with one gnarled finger. You need to give them a way to save face, a victory they can claim, however small. Matthias, who had been listening in silence, spoke up. What if we frame it as a mutual victory? Both sides agreeing to end the conflict not because they were defeated, but because they are strong enough to choose peace. Corva considered that. That might work. Pride is a powerful motivator, especially when it allows people to walk away from a bad situation without admitting they were wrong. They refined the proposal late into the night, shaping it into something that might, just might, be acceptable to both sides. By the time they finished, Tessa was exhausted and her eyes burned with fatigue, but she also felt something she had not felt in weeks: hope. The morning of the meeting dawned clear and cold, frost glittering on the grass and the sky a pale, washed-out blue. Tessa dressed carefully, choosing practical clothes rather than anything fancy, wanting to present herself as someone serious and competent rather than a decorative prize. Matthias wore the same worn leathers he always did, but he had cleaned and oiled them, and his sword hung at his hip, polished and ready. They set out before dawn, Tessa and Matthias and Elder Corva, walking the winding path that led to the old mill. Tessa's parents stayed behind, watching from the doorway as they disappeared into the morning mist. The old mill sat on the border between orc and human territory, a crumbling stone structure that had not ground grain in a generation. The water wheel was broken, the roof half collapsed, but the main room was still intact, and it had the advantage of being visible from both sides of the river. Neutral ground in a conflict where neutrality was a rare and precious thing. Commander Isabel Wright was already there when they arrived, flanked by 2 soldiers and looking every inch the military officer she was. She was a tall woman, perhaps in her 40s, with iron-gray hair pulled back in a severe bun and eyes that had seen too many battles. She regarded Matthias with an expression that was equal parts anger and disappointment. "Matthias Wade, you have caused me a great deal of trouble." "Yes, madam," Matthias said. He stood at attention out of long habit, his posture respectful but not apologetic. "I regret the trouble, but not the action. You were ordered to escort the tribute to Westridge. Instead, you walked her home and destroyed 3 weeks of careful negotiation." "The negotiation was built on a rotten foundation, Commander. You know that." Wright's jaw tightened. "What I know is that we had a treaty, fragile as it was, and now we have nothing." "You had a pause," Matthias said, "not a peace. The treaty demanded a sacrifice that no one should have been asked to make. It would have collapsed eventually, and when it did, the war would have been worse than before. You cannot know that. I know that trading a person like property is wrong. That should be enough." Wright was silent for a moment, her gaze shifting to Tessa. "And you agreed to the terms." "Why come back?" "Because he gave me a choice," Tessa said. She met the commander's eyes steadily, refusing to be intimidated. "The council made a decision for me. He gave me the option to refuse. That matters." "Does it?" Wright looked back at Matthias. "You have asked for this meeting. You claim to have an alternative to the failed treaty. I am here because I am tired of this war and because you were once a good soldier. Do not waste my time." Elder Corva stepped forward, leaning on her walking stick. "Commander Wright, I am Elder Corva of the Stonehill clan. I have advocated for peace for many years. I believe the young ones have a proposal worth hearing." Wright inclined her head in acknowledgement. "Then let us hear it." They gathered around the old millstone that had once ground wheat into flour and now served as an impromptu table. Matthias spread out the proposal, and for the next 2 hours they talked. It was not easy. Wright challenged every point, questioned every assumption, and demanded proof that the orc clans would honor the terms. Corva pushed back just as hard, insisting on guarantees that Westridge would not use the peace as an opportunity to gather intelligence or position troops for a future invasion. But beneath the arguments and objections, Tessa could hear something else. Exhaustion. Grief. A bone-deep weariness with violence and loss. Both women had paid the price of war in blood and sorrow, and neither wanted to pay it again if there was any alternative. Tessa herself spoke little, but when she did, her words seemed to carry weight. She talked about what it had felt like to stand on the riverbank and know she was being traded away, about the fear and helplessness and anger that had consumed her. She talked about Matthias refusing, about the choice he had given her, and about how that single act of defiance had shown her that peace did not have to be built on sacrifice. "If this treaty is going to work," she said, "it has to be something both sides can live with. Not something imposed by force or bought with lives, but something chosen freely because it benefits everyone." She looked at Wright, then at Corva. "You have both lost people you love to this war. Do you really want to lose more, or are you willing to try something different?" Silence fell over the mill. Wright stared at the proposal, her fingers tracing the lines of text. Corva watched the commander with hooded eyes, waiting. Finally, Wright spoke. "The terms are acceptable. I will take them to the Westridge Council and recommend approval." Corva nodded. "And I will present them to the clan elders. I cannot promise they will agree, but I will argue in favor." "That is all we ask," Matthias said. Wright looked at him, and something in her expression softened. "You are a damned fool, Wade, but you are a brave one. If this works, if we actually manage to build a lasting peace, it will be because you had the courage to refuse an unjust order." She paused. "If it fails, you will likely be executed as a deserter, I know. And you did it anyway." "Yes, madam." She shook her head, a faint smile touching her lips. Youth and idealism, a dangerous combination. She gathered up the proposal and turned to leave. At the threshold, she paused. "Matthias, when this is done, assuming you survive, come see me. The militia could use officers with your sense of honor." Then she was gone, her soldiers trailing behind her, leaving Tessa and Matthias and Elder Corva standing in the ruined mill with the morning light slanting through the broken roof. "Well," Corva said, "that went better than expected. Now comes the hard part." She was right. The next 2 weeks were a blur of meetings and arguments as both sides debated the merits of the new treaty. Tessa attended the clan councils, standing beside Elder Corva and making the case for peace. Some of the elders were receptive, tired of the endless cycle of violence and eager for a way out. Others were resistant, unwilling to trust the humans or accept anything less than total victory. Matthias faced similar resistance in Westridge. Though Commander Wright supported the treaty, others in the militia and the town council saw it as weakness, a betrayal of the soldiers who had died fighting. Matthias found himself defending his actions again and again, walking a knife's edge between vindication and execution. But slowly, painfully, support began to build. Merchants on both sides saw the potential for profit in a stable peace. Families who had lost loved ones to the war spoke out in favor of ending the conflict. And gradually, reluctantly, the councils began to shift. 3 weeks after the meeting at the mill, both sides agreed to sign the new treaty. The ceremony was held at the river crossing, the same place where Tessa had been offered as tribute and Matthias had refused. This time, there was no frightened girl in a wedding dress, no armed soldiers glaring across the water, just 2 groups of exhausted people ready to try something new. Elder Corva and Commander Wright signed the treaty on a beautiful autumn afternoon, the parchment laid out on a wooden table set up in the middle of the ford. The terms were read aloud in both languages, witnessed by representatives from both sides. When it was done, the 2 women shook hands and a cheer went up from the assembled crowd. Tessa stood beside Matthias and watched as people who had been enemies began to talk, tentative and awkward but hopeful. She felt his hand brush against hers, a question and an offering all at once. She took it, lacing her fingers through his, and felt him squeeze gently in response. "We did it," she said softly. "You did it," he corrected. "You were the one who refused to accept being traded. I just walked you home. You gave me a choice. That changed everything." He looked down at her, and in his eyes she saw something that made her breath catch. Not pity, not duty. Something warmer and deeper and infinitely more complex. "Tessa, Matthias Wade." They turned to see Commander Wright approaching, her expression stern. Matthias released Tessa's hand and straightened, falling back into military formality. "Madam, you are a damned fool," Wright said again. Then she smiled. "But a useful one. As of today, the charges of desertion against you are dropped. You are reinstated in the militia with the rank of lieutenant should you choose to accept." Matthias blinked, surprise clear on his face. "Madam, You do not have to decide now. Think about it. But know that Westridge could use officers like you. Men who understand that strength is not the same as cruelty, and that honor sometimes means refusing orders. She glanced at Tessa. Besides, I suspect you have other considerations now. She walked away before Matthias could respond, leaving him staring after her in bemusement. Tessa tried not to smile at his confusion. "What does that mean?" he asked. "I think she noticed that you have been spending a lot of time on the orc side of the river," Tessa said. "I have been working on the treaty. You have been working on my parents' farm." He had the grace to look embarrassed. "Your father needed help with the harvest." "My father has 3 neighbors who would have helped. He did not need you. Are you saying I should leave?" "No," Tessa said quickly, too quickly. She felt heat rise in her cheeks. "I am saying that maybe Commander Wright sees what I see, that you have reasons to stay besides diplomacy." Matthias was quiet for a moment, his gaze searching her face. "Do I?" It was terrifying, that question. Terrifying because she knew what he was really asking, and because answering it meant admitting things she had been trying not to think about for weeks. But she had stood on a riverbank and been traded like livestock, and he had given her a choice, and if she did not have the courage to be honest now, then what had any of it been for? "Yes," she said. "You do." His face transformed, hope and wonder and something like relief washing over his features. "Tessa, I do not know how to do this. Court you properly, I mean. My people and your people have been enemies for so long, and I do not want to do anything that would hurt you or make things harder for your family." "Then do not," she said. "Do not court me like I am fragile or foreign or something that needs to be handled with elaborate ritual. Just be with me. The way you have been, honest and steady and real." "I can do that," he said. His hand found hers again, and this time he did not let go. "I would like to do that very much." They stood together by the river as the sun sank toward the horizon. And for the first time in 20 years, the border between their peoples felt less like a wound and more like a bridge. The months that followed were not easy. Building a lasting peace was harder than signing a treaty, and there were setbacks and challenges at every turn. Some on both sides resented the new arrangement and worked to undermine it. Bandits took advantage of the changing patrols to raid isolated farms. Trade negotiations fell apart over tariffs and regulations. But slowly, things improved. The joint trading post at the old mill became a thriving market where merchants from both sides met to exchange goods and gossip. Patrols from Westridge and the Stonehill clan began coordinating, sharing information and working together to protect the border region. Children who had grown up knowing only war began to see members of the other species as neighbors rather than enemies. And through it all, Matthias and Tessa grew closer. He spent more time on the orc side of the river than the human side, helping Tessa's father with the farm work and becoming a familiar presence in the valley. Tessa in turn began visiting Westridge, accompanying her father on trading trips and slowly overcoming her fear of the human settlement. It was not always comfortable. There were stares and whispers, people on both sides who disapproved of their relationship or saw it as a betrayal. But there were also those who supported them, who saw in their partnership a symbol of the peace both peoples were trying to build. 6 months after the treaty was signed, on a spring evening when the apple trees were in bloom and the valley was soft with new green, Matthias asked Tessa to marry him. They were sitting on the fence rail where they had sat that first evening, watching the sun set over the hills. He did not have a ring, no grand gesture or elaborate proposal. He just turned to her and said, "Tessa Zorrath, would you be my wife?" She looked at him, this quiet, stubborn man who had refused to accept an unjust order and walked her home instead, who had risked everything for a principle and asked for nothing in return, who had given her a choice when no one else would. "Yes," she said. "Yes, I will." He kissed her then, soft and reverent, and she kissed him back and tasted hope and apples and the promise of a future neither of them had dared imagine. The wedding was held a month later, at the crossing where the new bridge was being built. It was a joint ceremony, blending orc and human traditions, officiated by both Elder Corva and Commander Wright. Tessa wore a new dress, this one green as summer leaves, and Matthias wore his dress uniform, the lieutenant's insignia bright on his shoulder. The bridge foundation provided a natural altar, the stones still being laid but already forming the span that would connect the two sides of the river. Tessa and Matthias stood on it and spoke their vows, promising to honor and cherish each other, to build a life together that reflected the peace they had fought for. When they sealed their promises with a kiss, the assembled crowd erupted in cheers. Orcs and humans, former enemies, celebrating a union that would have been unthinkable a year before. The festival that followed was raucous and joyful, music and dancing and food from both cultures laid out on long tables. Children ran between the adults, playing games that mixed orc and human rules. Elders from both sides sat together and told stories, finding common ground in shared losses and shared hopes. As the evening wore on and the stars came out, Tessa and Matthias slipped away from the crowd and walked to the edge of the river. The water ran clear and cold, reflecting the moon, and somewhere downstream a nightbird sang. "Are you happy?" Matthias asked. Tessa leaned against him, his arm around her shoulders, and looked out at the bridge taking shape across the water. A year ago she had stood on this bank and prepared to be traded away, to sacrifice herself for a peace that was not really peace at all. Now she stood here as a free woman, married to the man she loved, watching two peoples learn to live together. "Yes," she said, "I am happy." He kissed the top of her head. "Good, that is all I ever wanted, for you to be happy and free." They stood there for a long time, listening to the river and the distant sounds of celebration. Above them, the bridge grew stone by stone, a permanent reminder that the best foundations were built on choice rather than sacrifice, on respect rather than subjugation. A year later, the bridge was complete, and the annual Peace Festival was held to commemorate it. The festival had become a tradition, a time when both peoples came together to celebrate the treaty and remember how hard it had been won. There were contests and games, trade fairs and cultural exchanges, and a solemn ceremony at the bridge where the names of those lost in the war were read aloud, and flowers were cast into the river. Tessa and Matthias attended together, no longer the subject of whispers and stares, but simply another couple among many. Tessa's belly was round with her first pregnancy, and Matthias hovered protectively, making sure she did not overexert herself in the summer heat. Commander Wright found them near the bridge, watching as workers put the finishing touches on the railings. "The bridge looks good," she said. "Almost as good as the peace." "The peace is holding?" Matthias asked. "Better than expected. Trade is up 30% from last year. We have had only 3 incidents of violence and all were resolved without escalation." Wright smiled. "I never thought I would see it. Real peace, not just an absence of war." "It almost did not happen," Tessa said, "but it did, because 2 people had the courage to refuse an unjust bargain." Wright looked at them both, her expression warm. "You should be proud, both of you." "We are just trying to live our lives," Matthias said, "and in doing so you showed everyone else how to live theirs." Wright nodded to them and moved on, leaving them alone by the bridge. Tessa rested her hand on her belly and felt the flutter of movement inside, their child responding to the warmth and noise of the festival. In a few months, she would give birth to a son, and they would name him Gregory, a strong name for a boy who would grow up in a world without war. "What are you thinking?" Matthias asked. "That I am grateful," she said, "that you refused, that you walked me home, that you gave me a choice when no one else would." He took her hand and pressed it to his lips. "I would do it again, 1,000 times over. I know." They stood together on the bridge they had helped build, not the stone one that spanned the river, but the invisible one that connected two hearts and two peoples. Around them, the festival continued, laughter and music rising into the summer air. Children played in the shallows, splashing without regard for which side of the river they came from. Merchants haggled over prices, their arguments good-natured now rather than hostile. Elders sat in the shade and watched the young people dance, their faces tired but content. It was not perfect. There were still tensions, still people who clung to old grudges and old hatreds. But it was better, so much better than it had been. And it was real, built on mutual benefit and genuine respect rather than coercion and fear. Tessa looked at her husband, this man who had been her enemy and was now her love, and thought about the life they were building together. It would not always be easy. There would be challenges ahead, moments when the peace felt fragile and the future uncertain. But they would face those moments together, side by side, choosing each other and choosing hope. "Come on," she said. "Let us go join the festival. I promised my mother we would dance." Matthias laughed, a sound that still surprised her with its warmth. "I do not dance well. Neither do I." "We will be terrible together." "That sounds perfect." They walked hand in hand back toward the celebration, two people who had been traded, had refused to be traded, and had instead chosen each other freely. Behind them, the bridge stood strong and solid, a symbol of everything they had fought for and everything they had won. The crossing where she had almost been traded away was now the foundation of a lasting peace. The man who had walked her home instead of claiming her as tribute was now her partner in life and in the building of a better world. And the choice he had given her, that single act of defiance and compassion, had rippled outward to touch hundreds of lives. As the music swelled and the dancers spun beneath the stars, Tessa Zorrath Wade knew that she was exactly where she was meant to be. Not because someone had decided it for her, not because she had been traded or sold or sacrificed, but because she had chosen it herself. And that, more than any treaty or bridge or festival, was the greatest victory of all. Years passed, and the peace deepened. The bridge that had been new and uncertain became an old friend, its stones worn smooth by countless feet. The trading post at the mill expanded into a proper market town, with buildings from both architectural traditions standing side by side. Children who had been born after the war grew up speaking both languages, playing together without the burden of ancient hatreds. Tessa and Matthias raised their son Gregory in the valley, in a house they built together on land that straddled the old border. It was a deliberate choice, a statement that boundaries were things that could be crossed and blurred and ultimately erased by love and will. Gregory grew up strong and curious, with his mother's green skin and pointed ears and his father's dark eyes and quiet determination. Tessa's parents grew old gracefully, her father's strength slowly fading but his spirit undimmed. He took fierce pride in his grandson, teaching the boy the secrets of the land and the old orc ways. Matthias's relationship with his in-laws deepened into genuine affection, the old warrior and the former soldier finding common ground in their shared love for Tessa and Gregory. Commander Wright retired from active duty and was elected mayor of Westridge, a position from which she continued to champion the peace and the alliance with the orc clans. Elder Corva lived to see her great-great-grandchildren playing with human children at the bridge festivals, and died peacefully in her sleep at the age of 93, content in the knowledge that her advocacy had borne fruit. And through it all, Tessa and Matthias built their life together. It was not always easy. There were still moments of prejudice and suspicion, still people on both sides who looked at their mixed family with distrust or disapproval. But those voices grew quieter with each passing year, drowned out by the louder chorus of those who had learned that peace was better than war and love was stronger than hate. On the 10th anniversary of the treaty, there was a grand celebration at the bridge. Dignitaries from both peoples attended, speeches were made, and a plaque was unveiled commemorating the courage of those who had refused to accept an unjust bargain. Tessa and Matthias were honored as symbols of the peace, though both of them insisted they were simply ordinary people who had done what they thought was right. That evening, after the speeches and the ceremonies and the formal dinners were over, Tessa and Matthias walked together to the bridge. It was late, the moon high and full, the river silver beneath it. They stood where they had been married 10 years before and looked out at the valley they had helped heal. "Do you ever regret it?" Tessa asked. "What you gave up when you refused to take me across the river?" Matthias was quiet for a moment, considering. "I gave up a military career that was going nowhere, a life of following orders I did not believe in, a peace bought with someone else's freedom. No, I do not regret it. You gave up more than that. You gave up your place in Westridge, your standing, your security. You risked execution." "I gained more," he said simply. "I gained you a family, a home, a life worth living." He turned to face her, taking both her hands in his. "Tessa, walking you home instead of taking you as tribute was the first truly right thing I ever did. Every good thing in my life since then has flowed from that choice. How could I possibly regret it?" She smiled, tears pricking her eyes. "I love you. I love you too." He kissed her, soft and sweet, and she kissed him back and tasted the decade they had built together. Every joy and sorrow an ordinary moment. Behind them, the bridge stood solid and permanent, a testament to the truth that the strongest foundations were built on freedom and choice. Before them, the valley stretched out peaceful and prosperous, two peoples learning to live as neighbors and friends. And between them, Tessa and Matthias held each other close and knew that they had built something that would outlast them both. Not just a peace, not just a bridge, but a future where no one would be traded away, where choices mattered and love was stronger than fear. The river flowed on beneath the bridge, eternal and unchanging. But the people who lived beside it had changed, had grown, had learned that the hardest and most necessary revolutions sometimes began with a single person refusing to accept injustice and choosing compassion instead. Matthias Wade had walked Tessa Zorrath home instead of claiming her as tribute, and in doing so had changed the course of history for two peoples. It was not a grand gesture, not a battle won or a kingdom claimed. It was simply one man seeing a wrong and refusing to perpetuate it, one woman being given the choice that should have been hers all along. But sometimes, the smallest acts of defiance are the ones that echo the loudest. Sometimes, walking someone home is the most revolutionary thing you can do. And sometimes, refusing to trade people like property is the first step toward building a world where everyone is free to choose their own path. Tessa and Matthias had taken that first step together, and in the years since, thousands of others had followed. The bridge they stood on now was more than stone and mortar. It was a promise, a possibility, a testament to the power of choosing kindness over cruelty and freedom over fear. They walked home that night hand in hand, their son waiting for them in the house they had built together. And as they went, Tessa looked back once at the bridge gleaming in the moonlight and thought about the girl she had been, standing terrified at the crossing, and the woman she had become, free and loved and exactly where she chose to be. The journey from that riverbank to this moment had not been easy, but it had been worth every step, and she knew, with the certainty that comes from hard-won experience, that the best things in life were not the ones given or taken, but the ones chosen freely and built with care. The treaty held, the peace endured, and Tessa Zorrath Wade lived out her days in the valley she loved, with the man who had given her a choice and the family they had built together. It was not a fairy tale ending, because real life was messier and harder than that. But it was a good ending, an honest ending, an ending earned through courage and compassion, and the simple, revolutionary act of refusing to accept injustice. And in the end, that was more than enough.